Before we begin this story, I want to know from you, where are you watching from? Leave your city and country in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories are reaching. And if you enjoy dark mysteries, unexplained disappearances, and stories that make you think twice before going to sleep, subscribe to the channel now. The castle didn't appear on tourist maps, nor in recent records of buildings in the region. Even so, any resident of the small town of Ashford knew exactly where it was. All they had to do was follow the old road, move away from the town centre, and climb a narrow path surrounded by dense trees. At the top of the hill, hidden among the vegetation, stood the dark stone building that seemed out of place in time, as if it had been transported directly from Europe to the American heartland. The building was known simply as the Baron's Castle. No one used the owner's full name. Victor Hale was rarely mentioned, almost always in a low voice, as if pronouncing his name were an unnecessary gesture. What little was known came from old accounts. He had arrived in the country decades earlier with a considerable fortune and no verifiable history. He bought the isolated plot of land, hired workers from outside the city, and within a few years erected the structure that clashed completely with the surrounding landscape. Since then, the castle has remained occupied, but never opened. Residents weren't invited, visitors weren't welcome, and yet people came in often enough to keep the place running. Gardeners, drivers, maids, always hired discreetly, almost never through local recommendations. And over time, something began to repeat itself. These people didn't stay. Initially, the disappearances were treated as coincidences. An employee who quit their job without notice, another who decided to leave town, someone who simply vanished. But the repetition transformed coincidence into a pattern. In recent months, 3 names had been officially registered as missing, all with a direct link to the castle. No bodies were found, no formal charges were filed. The case didn't make national headlines. There wasn't enough pressure for that to happen. But it caught the attention of someone who didn't usually ignore incomplete patterns. Daniel Carter arrived in Ashford on a cold morning, bringing with him only the essentials: a backpack, a notepad, a tape recorder, and a clear line of investigation. A journalist specializing in neglected cases, he had built his career debunking poorly explained stories, not because he believed in mysteries, but precisely because he didn't believe in them. For Daniel, everything had a reason, and more often than not, someone is interested in hiding it. He started with the simplest thing, talking to the locals. The reception wasn't friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was something more subtle, a silent resistance. The answers were short, evasive, and any direct mention of the castle quickly ended the conversation. There was fear there, but it wasn't hysteria, it was caution. Certain details began to emerge as Daniel persisted. An old merchant commented, without going into detail, that deliveries were made weekly at the castle gate, always left outside. A mechanic stated that he had been called to repair a car on the property, but never saw who was driving it. An older woman mentioned seeing lights on at unusual hours, even when it was said that the Baron was out of the country. Nothing conclusive, but enough to warrant an investigation. Daniel then turned to the formal records. Public documents indicated that the property was registered in the name of a private company, with no visible commercial activity. This type of structure is frequently used to conceal true ownership and financial transactions. Victor Hale's name only appeared in old files, too old for someone who theoretically still lived there. That inconsistency was enough. On his second night in the city, Daniel decided to approach the castle. The road leading up the hill was little used. The uneven asphalt soon gave way to dirt, and the surrounding trees formed a natural corridor that blocked most of the light. As he drove further, the surroundings seemed more isolated, not just physically, but in a way that was hard to define, as if the place were disconnected from the rest of the city. When the castle finally emerged from among the trees, Daniel slowed down. The structure was larger than I had imagined, and more intact than it should be. There were no signs of neglect. The walls were well preserved, the windows intact, and the iron gate, although old, showed no significant wear. The access path appeared clean, as if it were regularly maintained. That was no forgotten building. It was a lively place. He parked a short distance away and got out of the car, observing his surroundings. No movement, no sound. Not even the wind seemed to move naturally through that space. The gate was ajar. That detail in itself already contradicted the entire logic of the place. Daniel crossed slowly, alert for any sign. The ground beneath his feet produced a dry sound, but it was quickly muffled by the surrounding silence. He approached the front door and tested the doorknob. Destrancada. Hesitation came, but it didn't last. He went in. The castle's interior was spacious and surprisingly clean. The main hall opened before him with a high ceiling supported by dark wooden beams. An antique chandelier hung from the ceiling, unlit. The stone floor was free of dust or accumulated dirt. Everything seemed to be as it was, but there was no one there. Daniel took a few steps forward, analyzing the surroundings with a technical eye. On the walls, old portraits caught his attention. Serious faces, heavy frames, no identifying marks. The clothes and styles varied, as if representing different eras. That didn't make sense as a typical collection. He mentally recorded every detail. "Is anyone here?" he called out firmly. Her own voice sounded out of place in the environment. No response. For a few seconds, everything remained still, until a sound broke the silence. Steps. Coming from the upper floor. Slow, irregular, dragging. Daniel stopped immediately, focusing all his attention on the staircase in front of him. The pattern of the sound didn't match that of someone walking normally. There was weight in every movement and a strange lack of coordination, as if whoever was up there wasn't completely in control of their own body. "Hello?" he called again. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. But now it was different, denser, more present. Daniel cautiously advanced to the base of the stairs. It was then that he noticed something that hadn't been visible from where he had entered. On the side wall, within easy reach, there were marks, scratches, several, aligned at different heights, overlapping, as if they had been made at different times. He approached to take a closer look. The surfaces were worn, and in some places the stone had been scraped forcefully. That wasn't old. It was recent, and it didn't seem accidental. Before he could analyze it further, a new sound echoed through the upper floor, this time closer to the stairs. A dry impact, followed by something being dragged. Daniel slowly raised his gaze. The top of the stairs remained partially obscured by the shadow. Then came the final sound, low, almost inaudible. A whisper, without clear words, but unmistakably human. At that moment, for the first time since arriving in the city, Daniel stopped thinking like a journalist, and he began to think like someone who had crossed a line. Something in that place was not just hidden, it was active. And somehow, aware of his presence, Daniel did not back down immediately. His instinct told him to leave, reorganize his thoughts, perhaps return with some kind of support. But logic, the same logic that guided him in all his investigations, pushed him in the opposite direction. There was someone in that castle. That, in itself, transformed the rumor into fact, and facts demanded proximity. He took his first step onto the ladder, carefully testing the weight. The wood responded with a slight creak, but nothing more. He climbed another step, then another, keeping his gaze fixed on the top, partially obscured by the shadow. No new sound. Silence always returned too quickly in that place, as if it had been artificially restored. Upon reaching the upper floor, the corridor proved to be long and narrow, with doors distributed on both sides. Some were ajar, others completely closed. The lighting was almost non-existent, coming only from small slivers in the high windows. Daniel picked up his cell phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light slowly traced the corridor, revealing details that were not visible from below. The floor was clean, just like in the main hall, but there were subtle marks, scratches, small stains, signs of something that had been removed hastily or frequently. That indicated constant use, but not normal use. He approached the first half-open door. He pushed it gently with his fingertips. It was a room. Too simple for someone who worked there permanently. A narrow bed, a chair, a small table. No personal belongings, no clothes, no photographs, nothing to indicate permanence. It looked like a space that had been used and then erased. Daniel mentally noted it down and proceeded to the next door. The pattern repeated itself. Functional, clean rooms, but completely impersonal. As if each person who passed through there was only temporary or didn't have enough time to leave any mark. As he walked down the corridor, he noticed something different at the end. A bigger door, closed. No visible door handle from the outside. That didn't match the rest of the structure. Before he could get closer, a sound came from another point on the floor. No more footsteps, but something lighter. A quick movement. Daniel turned the beam of his flashlight to the opposite side of the hallway. For a moment, a very brief one, he thought he saw something move behind one of the doors. He walked over there immediately and opened it at once. Empty, but not completely. There was one detail that wasn't present in the other rooms. On the floor, near the wall, a darker mark caught the eye. It wasn't ordinary dirt. It was irregular, as if it had been caused by something repeatedly dragged across the same spot. Daniel crouched down, bringing the light closer. The flooring material was worn out there. That wouldn't happen with light use. It required strength and repetition. He stood up slowly. Now there was a clearer pattern. Rooms without identity, signs of frequent removal of something heavy, marks of resistance on the walls. None of that suggested a typical domestic routine. It indicated control. Containment is possible. Daniel returned to the hallway, once again focusing his attention on the larger door at the end. This time, he walked straight to it. He stopped in front of the structure. No external door handle, no visible lock. He ran his hand over the surface, free, solid. Designed to be difficult to open from that side, that wasn't a room. It was a compartment. Before I could test anything else, a sound came from inside, weak but unmistakable. A light touch, like fingers tapping on wood. Once, then two, and then silence. Daniel instinctively took a step back. Breathing became more controlled, but heavier. That eliminated any remaining doubt. There was someone inside, and that person was not free. He turned around quickly when he heard another sound behind him, this time coming from the stairs. Steps again, but now they're different. Firms, regulars, controlled. Someone was going up. Daniel immediately turned off the flashlight, plunging the hallway into twilight. The sound was getting closer. No rush, without hesitation. Unlike the previous steps, these had a clear intention. He looked around, assessing his options. The open doors offered no real hiding place. The corridor was too long to escape without being seen. There was only one immediate choice left. Daniel went into the nearest room and slowly closed the door, leaving it just a tiny crack. Outside, the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They stopped. For a second, that seemed too long. Then they started again, slower, as if whoever was there was watching, looking for. The sound traveled down the hallway, past one door, then another. Every step was calculated, no rush, flawless. Daniel held his breath, keeping his body still. The shadow cast by the crack in the door changed. Someone was outside, stopped, very close, without making any sound. The silence lasted longer, until finally the footsteps moved again, continuing down the corridor, towards the main door, the same one from where the sound was coming. Daniel couldn't see, but he could hear clearly. The light contact with the wood. A mechanism is being activated, and then the door is opening, slowly. Daniel remained motionless inside the room, his body rigid, his senses completely focused on what was happening in the hallway. The crack in the door was small, but enough for him to perceive changes in the light and shadows. The sound of the larger door opening echoed muffledly, followed by an even more unsettling silence. Then came the noises. They weren't footsteps. They were erratic movements, accompanied by a heavy dragging sound, as if something were being moved carelessly. There was a sharp impact against some surface, then another, then a sound that made Daniel clench his teeth involuntarily, a low, almost muffled groan. That left no room for doubt. Someone was being held there, and he wasn't in a normal state. Daniel's breathing became more controlled, but his mind began to reorganize everything he had seen up to that moment. The empty rooms, the marks on the walls, the wear on the floor, the absence of any personal trace, everything pointed to a systematic pattern. People entered the castle, stayed for a while, and then disappeared without a trace. But now he knew they weren't simply going to leave. Something was happening in there, and it kept happening. The sound in the hallway changed again. Firm footsteps moved away from the main door, returning the same way. Slow, steady, without any sign of urgency. Whoever was there was acting with complete control of the situation. Daniel retreated a little further into the room, avoiding any risk of being seen through the crack. The almost imperceptible creaking of the floor beneath his foot made him freeze for a second, but the footsteps outside remained unchanged. They continued. They went through the door. They headed towards the stairs, and then they disappeared downstairs. Silence returned, but this time Daniel didn't trust him. He waited. He mentally counted the seconds, then the minutes. Nothing. Only when he was sure there was no more movement did he approach the door again and look through the crack. The hallway was empty. Now or never. He cautiously left the room, keeping his steps light. His focus immediately returned to the end of the corridor, where the larger door remained ajar. The air seemed colder in that direction, denser. Daniel advanced slowly, listening for any sound coming from the lower floor. Nothing. Only the constant silence that dominated the castle. Upon reaching the door, he hesitated for a brief moment, and then he pushed. The atmosphere on the other side was completely different from the other rooms. There was no attempt to make it seem like a habitable space. The walls were exposed stone, the floor uneven, and the lighting came from a single weak lamp hanging from the ceiling. The smell was the first thing that struck us. It wasn't decomposition, but it wasn't clean either. It was a metallic smell, mixed with dampness and something else difficult to identify, like air that had been stagnant for too long. In the center of the room, there was an iron structure fixed to the floor. Currents, thick, attached to metal rings. Daniel felt his stomach clench. That wasn't improvised. It was permanent. Designed. He took a few steps forward, analyzing the space with heightened attention. There were marks on the walls, similar to those he had seen on the stairs, but deeper, more intense. Some areas were worn as if they had been repeatedly struck. And then he saw. In the darkest corner of the room, a figure, seated, property. Daniel stopped immediately. The dim light didn't allow for clear details, but it was enough to confirm it was a person, viva, or at least not completely inert. "Hey!" he called, keeping his voice low. No immediate response. He took another step. The figure moved, slowly. The head was raised just enough to reveal part of the face. The eyes were open, but there was something wrong with them. It wasn't just fear, it was absence, as if the person were physically there, but disconnected from everything around them. Daniel moved closer, now with extreme caution. The chains were attached to their wrists and also to the ankles. Deep marks indicated that this was not a recent occurrence. "Can you speak?" he asked. The person opened their mouth. No sound came out. The attempt seemed to require too much effort. Daniel looked around, searching for some way to release the chains. There were no visible keys nor any tools nearby. Everything in that space seemed designed to prevent any kind of escape. It was then that a new sound interrupted everything. Coming from the hallway. Steps again. But now they're faster, more direct. Someone was coming back. Daniel reacted immediately, taking a step back and assessing his surroundings. There was nowhere to hide in there, no alternative exit. He looked at the person in chains, then at the door. Time was up. The footsteps drew closer quickly. They stopped outside, and without hesitation the door began to open. The door opened abruptly. Daniel had no time to retreat or improvise. The dim light from the hallway flooded the room, projecting the silhouette of a tall man with a rigid posture, who stopped immediately upon noticing the unexpected presence. For a second, neither of them moved. The man showed no exaggerated surprise. His gaze swept over Daniel from head to toe with controlled calm, as if he were assessing an unforeseen variable, but not necessarily one out of control. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a low, firm voice. There was no explicit threat in the voice, but there was no doubt about it either. Daniel maintained his posture, avoiding any sudden movements. "And you shouldn't be keeping people chained up," he replied bluntly. The man's gaze changed subtly, not out of anger, but for something more analytical. "You don't understand what you're seeing." Daniel took a slight step to the side, trying to keep the man in his field of vision without losing sight of the chained person. "Then explain." The silence that followed was not hesitant, it was calculated. The man seemed to be deciding how much was worth revealing. "These people didn't disappear," he said finally. "They were brought here." "Against my will," Daniel retorted. The man did not deny it. To be contained. That was not a justification. It was a cold statement. Before Daniel could answer, a sound coming from the chained figure caught their attention. A more intense movement, a visible effort. The eyes, previously empty, were now fixed on the man at the door, and there was something new about them. Agitation. The man reacted immediately, taking a step forward. "Stay behind me," he ordered curtly. Daniel disobeyed. "What did you do to her?" The man ignored the question. His eyes were completely focused on the chained person now. Her breathing had changed. Faster, irregular, as if she were fighting something internally. Then came the sound, a dry crack. One of the chains tightened forcefully. Daniel involuntarily took a step back. That wasn't just weakness, there was strength there, out of control. "Now you understand," said the man, still not looking at Daniel. "They can't leave." The sentence didn't sound like a justification, it sounded like a warning. Before Daniel could react, the man quickly moved to the side wall and activated something almost invisible. A mechanism responded with a metallic click, and a second containment structure descended from the ceiling, partially locking the area where the person was. That wasn't improvised, it was a system. Planned. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, now with more urgency. "We are not the problem," the man replied. "So what is it?" This time there was hesitation. "Short, but it's real. What happens to them? Begins before they even get here." Daniel frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "There's no need to do that," the man replied. "It just needs to be restrained." The conflict there was no longer just physical. There was something bigger, something that didn't fit into the simple logic of a common crime. But Daniel was not willing to accept incomplete answers. 3 people have officially disappeared. How many are actually here? The man did not answer directly. "More than you could possibly help." That wasn't arrogance. It was a fact. The silence was broken by a new sound. Coming from the hallway, different from the previous 2, more than one, multiple steps, synchronized. Daniel looked immediately at the door. "You're not alone here." The man finally turned his gaze to him. "I've never been." The footsteps were drawing closer rapidly, no attempt to hide their presence. Without caution, that changed everything. "You need to leave," the man said, now with real urgency for the first time. "Now! And leave this here. If you stay, you won't leave." It wasn't a threat. It was predicted. Daniel hesitated, for the first time since entering the castle, not out of fear, but that was because the situation had gotten beyond what he could control on his own. The footsteps reached the door. They stopped. A dry beat echoed. 1, 2... No waiting. The doorknob began to turn. The man reacted instantly, positioning himself between the door and the inside of the room. "Decide," he said, without looking back. Daniel looked at the person in chains, then to the door, then back to the man. "Time's up." The door began to open. The door slammed shut. This time it wasn't just one man. 3 figures entered the room almost simultaneously, moving with coordinated precision. They wore dark, unmarked clothing and showed no surprise at seeing Daniel there. On the contrary, his presence seemed anticipated. The man who was in the room did not back down. "He's not part of it," he said firmly. One of the newcomers replied immediately, "Now do it." There was no discussion. Tension turned into action in seconds. Daniel barely had time to react when 2 of the men advanced toward him. He tried to back away, but the space was limited. One of them gripped his arm tightly, while the other tried to immobilize him by the shoulder. Daniel reacted on instinct. He turned his body, partially escaping the initial contact, and pushed one of the men against the wall. The impact was strong enough to create space for a second, enough time for him to move toward the door. But the 3rd man was already there, blocking the exit. No rush, without visible effort. Daniel stopped. The situation had changed completely. That was no longer an investigation. It was a restraint. "You went where you shouldn't have," said the man in front of him. "And you're keeping people prisoner here," Daniel retorted, breathless. "Keeping them alive," the man corrected. Before Daniel could answer, a sound from the back of the room interrupted everything, higher than before, more intense. The chained person moved abruptly, pulling on the chains with enough force to make the metal creak. The body, previously almost motionless, now trembled in uncoordinated spasms. The eyes, previously empty, were now wide open. And there was something about them that hadn't been there before, something active. The man who was in the room reacted immediately. "It's long overdue," he said urgently. One of the newcomers turned to him. "You delayed the procedure." "I was alone," he replied curtly. Daniel observed everything, trying to connect the dots. Procedure. That wasn't improvised. It was routine. Before I could process any more, the situation worsened. A loud crack echoed. One of the chains partially detached from the mooring. It didn't break, but he gave in. Enough. The person on the ground stood up abruptly, not completely, but enough to move from their previous position. The movement wasn't natural. It was too fast. Uncoordinated, but forceful. Dangerous. One of the men stepped forward to restrain them. Error. The reaction was immediate. The chained figure lunged forward violently, pulling at the bound arm and striking the man directly in the face. The sharp sound of the blow echoed through the room. Daniel froze. That was not normal human behavior, not in that state, not with that kind of force. The other 2 men reacted quickly, immobilizing the figure with difficulty. The effort was visible. Even weakened, she resisted with increasing intensity. "Hold on," one of them ordered. The man who was already in the room moved over to a metal box, fixed to the wall. He quickly opened it and took out a syringe. Daniel took a step back. Now everything was too clear. "What are you doing with them?" he demanded. No one answered. The syringe was inserted into the neck of the person being restrained. The reaction was not immediate. For a few seconds the resistance continued. Then gradually the movements began to slow down. The force gave way. The body relaxed until it returns to its previous state. Almost motionless, almost empty. The silence that followed was heavy, but now it's laden with meaning. Daniel was breathing faster, the mind trying to keep up with everything at once. Missing persons, kept prisoner, subjected to something, and transformed. "This isn't restraint," he said finally. "This is something else." D, the man who administered the injection, stood up slowly. And then he said something that completely changed the course of history. "Do you think they arrive like that?" Daniel remained silent. "They're not made here," he continued. "They arrive here already compromised." "Committed to what?" The man hesitated. He looked at the others. And then he replied, "Something we can't stop. We can only delay it." That didn't fit. Not entirely. But it explained part of the pattern. "Then why hide it?" Daniel insisted. "Because nobody outside would believe it," another man replied. "And by the time they did believe it, it would be too late." Silence fell again, but now it was different, heavier, broader. Daniel realized something at that moment, something I hadn't considered until then. If that was real. So the castle wasn't the origin, it was just a point, one among others. And that meant the problem wasn't isolated. It was scattered. Before she could ask another question, the man in front of her spoke again. "Now you have a problem." Daniel kept his gaze steady. "Which?" "You know too much." The sentence was not threatening. It definitely came. "And what does that change?" The man replied without hesitation. "You can't leave here the same way you came in." The meaning was immediate, and it's final. Daniel glanced quickly around. 3 men. A blocked exit. A situation beyond any foreseeable control. But there was also something new, a mistake. There is tension between them, an operation that wasn't perfect, and that was all he needed, because for the first time since he entered the castle, he was no longer just discovering what was happening there. He was part of it now. The silence that settled after the last sentence was not empty. It was decisive. Daniel quickly realized he was no longer in the position of an observer. Everything he had seen placed him right in the middle of the problem, and for those men, that meant risk. The balance of power had shifted. "So this is the part where you arrest me too," Daniel said, keeping his voice controlled. No one responded immediately. The 3 men exchanged quick, almost imperceptible glances. There was something there. A subtle but present disagreement. Not everyone seemed entirely aligned on what to do. The man who had spoken the most, the one who seemed to be leading, stepped forward. "That hasn't been decided yet." The answer brought no relief. It brought something worse. Uncertainty. "You already do this to others," Daniel retorted, discreetly pointing to the chained person. "What's the difference with me?" "You came in on your own," said another man. "That complicates things." Daniel absorbed the information quickly. That indicated a rule, and rules could be explored. "How complicated is that?" he insisted. The first man hesitated for a second. "Because no one will look for you immediately." That hit right in the face. That was true. Daniel hadn't informed anyone about that particular visit. His investigation was independent and discreet. He had always worked that way, but this time it worked against him. Before he could answer, the man who had been most silent until then approached the leader. "He's gone too far," she said in a low but firm tone. "He's seen too much. This can't leave this room." "It's not that simple," the leader replied. "It never is," the other retorted. The tension between them was increasing, and Daniel realized it. There was division, and division meant opportunity. While the men discussed things in hushed voices, he quickly surveyed the surroundings. The door remained partially open. The hallway beyond was still empty. The distance to the stairs was not great, but the problem wasn't leaving the room. It was time to leave the castle, and most importantly, the goal was to get out alive. If he moved too soon, he would be stopped. If he waited too long, he would lose any advantage he might have. He needed a breaking point, and he came. An unexpected sound echoed through the castle, unlike anything that had happened before. It wasn't a step. It wasn't an impact. It was an alarm. Low, continuous, almost muffled, but enough to completely alter men's behavior. Everyone stopped, immediately. The leader turned his face toward the runner. This was not planned. One of the others replied, "Lower section." The third one was already moving. "We don't have enough staff down there." That changed everything. The control they maintained began to crumble. "You," said the leader, pointing to one of the men, "stay here. Alone. We have no choice." The man's gaze swept quickly over Daniel. Assessment, calculation, and for the first time, a slight trace of doubt. The leader turned to Daniel for a brief moment. "Don't move." Then he left the room with another man, walking quickly down the hallway. The footsteps disappeared down the stairs. Now there were only two, Daniel and the remaining man. Silence returned, but completely different, more unstable, more dangerous. The man couldn't take his eyes off him. "It's not worth trying," he said firmly. Daniel did not answer, but his mind was already in motion. The sound of the alarm continued, distant, constant. Something had gotten out of control, and that didn't seem to be part of their plan. "What's going on down there?" Daniel asked. "Something that shouldn't happen," the man replied. Short, direct, without explanation, but enough. If there was anything worse than what was in that room, so the whole castle was a problem. The man's gaze shifted for a second. Small, but enough. Daniel acted. He advanced quickly, closing the distance before the other could fully react. The impact was direct, throwing the man against the side of the door. The reaction came, but too late. Daniel didn't try to fight. He tried to pass. He left the room and went into the hallway without looking back. Footsteps echoed as he ran towards the stairs. Behind him, the man was already recovering. "Stop!" Daniel didn't stop. He descended the first steps quickly, ignoring the risk of making a sound. The castle was no longer silent. The alarm was still active, creating a layer of chaos that hadn't existed before. Halfway up the stairs, almost there, then he saw, on the lower floor, something was wrong, very wrong. One of the doors, which had previously been closed, was open, and there were marks on the ground, recent, dragged, taking it out of the field of vision. Daniel slowed down instinctively. Not by choice, because something. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. And for the first time since entering the castle, the simplest possibility ceased to be the most likely. Perhaps what was happening there, it was no longer under anyone's control. Daniel stopped in the middle of the stairs for just a second, enough to understand that going down without thinking would be a mistake. Up until that moment, all he had done was react, follow sounds, observe patterns, escape immediate situations. But now the scenario was different. The castle was no longer under the complete control of those men, and that made everything more unpredictable. He could no longer act as a journalist. I needed to act like someone who wanted to get out alive. The alarm continued to echo, muffled by the thick walls. The sound wasn't loud, but constant enough to indicate that something critical was happening. And more importantly, it indicated that the men's attention was divided. That was an advantage, but also a warning. Daniel descended the rest of the stairs more cautiously, his steps now calculated. Upon reaching the lower floor, he stayed close to the wall, reducing his exposure. The main hall seemed the same, silent, intact. But the open side door completely changed the scene. That's where the marks on the ground came from, dragged, irregular, fresh. He approached slowly, keeping his body tense, prepared to react. Before crossing the threshold, he stopped and listened. Nothing. No steps, no voice. Only the distant alarm. Daniel entered. The atmosphere was different from the rest of the castle. Narrower, more functional, a technical corridor with less ornate walls and more direct lighting. There, the castle ceased to be an imposing facade and revealed something more practical, operational. The markings on the floor continued down that corridor, disappearing around a right-hand bend. Daniel stepped forward, Now every step was a conscious choice. He was no longer just looking for answers. I was trying to understand the system. Upon turning the corner, he found the partial origin of the chaos. A metal door forced open. The locking mechanism was damaged, as if it had been pushed from the inside out with enough force to compromise the structure. That was no ordinary escape. It was a breakup. Daniel approached slowly. He looked inside. The space beyond seemed similar to the room above, a containment structure, reinforced walls, a complete absence of comfort. But unlike the other, this one was empty. Loose chains, broken fasteners, and brands, many brands, deeper than anywhere else. Daniel took a step back, absorbing the information. That confirmed one essential thing. Not everyone remained restrained. Some escaped. A noise behind him interrupted his train of thought. Steps. Quick. The man he had left upstairs appeared in the hallway, visibly more tense. He stopped when he saw Daniel, and this time there was no warning. He went straight ahead. Daniel reacted differently. He did not try to flee immediately. He waited for the movement. When the man got close enough, Daniel dodged sideways, using the other man's own momentum against him. The impact threw the man against the wall, creating a brief but sufficient gap. Daniel didn't waste any opportunity. Male, but not towards the main exit. Now he had a new understanding. If something had been missed, leaving might not have been the safest option. He followed the technical corridor, moving away from the main hall. The logic now was simple: avoid direct confrontation and find an alternative route. While running, he observed, doors closed, some reinforced, others with small displays. That was more than just a castle. It was an expanded containment structure, planned. The alarm sound had changed slightly, more erratic now, as if it were malfunctioning or shutting down in parts. Another sign of loss of control. Daniel slowed down when he noticed another detail: silence, sudden, total. The alarm stopped, and that was worse. He stopped, controlled breathing, listening. That's when he heard. Ahead, no steps, but something lighter, irregular, like uncoordinated movement. He moved forward slowly. It turned into another corridor, and he saw. At the end, partially illuminated, there was someone, or something. The posture was unsteady, the body tilted strangely, as if not fully aligned. The movements were short, interrupted like failed attempts at coordination. Daniel did not approach, not this time. He observed, and he realized something crucial. It wasn't an immediate attack. It was a transition, as if things were still changing, transforming into something different from what it was before. Daniel's breathing became heavier. Now everything made sense in a broader and more dangerous way. People didn't just disappear, they were changing. And at some point in this process, they completely lost control. A distant sound of doors closing echoed through the castle. The men were trying to regain control, isolate areas, to contain what had come out. Daniel took a step back. Now he had two clear options: go back and try to leave by the familiar route, or continue advancing within the structure, understanding more and taking even more risks. But unlike before, now he was no longer lost. He was learning, and for the first time he was starting to play by the rules of the place. Daniel backed away slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the unsteady figure at the end of the corridor. He no longer had any doubts. This was one of the people who had been kept there. But the state in which it was found indicated something beyond imprisonment or abuse. It was a process, incomplete, unstable, and seemingly irreversible. And the most dangerous thing, unpredictable. Without making any sudden movements, he began to move away, step by step, avoiding any sound that might attract attention. The figure did not react immediately. It remained there in short, disjointed movements, as if trying to coordinate its own body. Daniel turned the corner slowly, and only then increased the distance. Now he had to decide. Continuing to explore meant understanding more, but it also increased the risk of encountering something worse. Returning to the main entrance seemed the logical course of action, but there was no longer any guarantee that that route would be clear. The men were moving, and something else too. The entire castle had become unstable. He chose to take an intermediate route, to advance far enough to find an alternative exit. As he moved through the technical corridors, he began to notice changes in the structure. Newer doors, exposed electrical systems, cameras, some working, others damaged. This indicated that the place had been adapted over time. It wasn't just old, it was constantly updated. Daniel found a secondary staircase, narrower, probably used for service. He climbed it quickly, avoiding returning to the main corridor on the second floor. Every decision now was strategic. Minimize encounters, maximize exit options. Upon reaching the top, he found a new level. Darker, less structured. The air there was heavier, as if that part of the city was less used or less controlled. But there was something important, a window, small, tall, but possible. Daniel approached, assessing the situation. It wasn't an easy way out, but it was a real alternative. Before he could test it, a sound came from the hallway behind him. This time, of course, steps, more than one, but different from the previous ones, disorganized, irregular, and fast. Daniel turned around slowly. It wasn't the men. They were different people, more than one, moving without coordination, moving forward without a pattern. That confirmed the worst-case scenario. There was more than one out of control. The castle wasn't just failing, it was collapsing. Daniel stepped back to the window, quickly assessing his surroundings. There was no time for lengthy calculations. He needed to act before he was surrounded. He looked around. A loose metal bar near the wall. An old table, partially broken, improvised elements. He pulled the bar, testing the weight. Enough. The sounds were getting closer, now much clearer. Irregular breathing, shuffled steps, impacts against the walls. Daniel positioned himself beside the door, out of direct line of sight. He waited. The first one appeared. Unstable movement. A lost gaze. But quickly, very fast. Once he was fully immersed in the space, Daniel acted. The strike was direct, using the weight of the bar to destabilize, not for prolonged confrontation. The body fell with impact, creating a momentary obstacle for the others. Without hesitation, Daniel stepped towards the window. He climbed onto the makeshift structure. He forced the opening. The wood partially gave way. One more effort. It broke. The cold air moved in immediately. He looked outside, considerable height, but not impossible. Behind him the sounds grew louder, closer, faster. Time was up. Daniel took a deep breath, and he made the decision. But before jumping, something caught his attention. In the reflection of the broken glass, a figure standing in the doorway of the hallway. It wasn't unstable. She wasn't uncoordinated. He was one of the men, observing, without intervening, as if he were waiting. That didn't make sense. Why not stop it? Why leave? The seconds passed by too quickly. Daniel had no answer, and he jumped. The impact against the ground was brutal. Daniel fell onto the damp ground, rolling down the slope of the hill until he came to a stop. Pain coursed through his entire body, but nothing seemed broken. Without time to assess the situation, he struggled to his feet, bracing himself on his knee for a second before forcing his body to continue. Behind him, the castle remained motionless, silent, as if nothing had happened. That was wrong. Everything inside pointed to chaos, escape, failure, loss of control. And yet outside there was no sign of anything, no lights on, no sounds, no movement, as if the place hid everything that happened inside it. Daniel took a few steps back, keeping his gaze fixed on the structure. The window he had jumped through was now dark and empty. No figure appeared, no persecution. That was no relief. It was yet another inconsistency. He turned, ready to go down the hill and reach the road, when a sound made him stop. It didn't come from the castle, it came further down, among the trees. A quick movement, then another one. Daniel stood motionless, observing. Whatever had escaped was no longer confined to the structure. I was outside, and that completely changed the scenario. He retreated slowly, trying to keep his distance, but the uneven terrain made it difficult. Each step had to be calculated to avoid a fall or an unnecessary sound. Then he saw. One of the figures emerged from among the trees. Unstable movement, but targeted. It wasn't random. It was coming towards him. Daniel took a deep breath, adjusting his posture. There was no way to avoid confrontation anymore, but unlike before, he didn't act impulsively. He observed. He analyzed it. The movements were quick, but not efficient. There was strength, but little coordination. The trajectory was not linear. Small deviations, imbalances, that was an advantage. As the figure advanced, Daniel waited until the very last moment. At the precise instant, he dodged sideways, using the creature's own momentum against it. The body rushed past him, stumbling on the incline and falling several meters below. Daniel didn't try to finish. That wasn't the intention. He needed to get out of there. He began to descend the hill more quickly, ignoring the pain and fatigue. The trees closed in around him, making it difficult to see, but also offering cover. More movements, more than one. That was not an isolated incident. There were others. The castle had not contained everything. Daniel accelerated. It was no longer a strategic escape. It was a matter of direct survival. The sounds behind him grew louder, breaking branches, uneven footsteps, heavy breathing. But none of them were perfectly coordinated. There was still flaw. There was still a lack of control. And that was what he trusted. When he finally caught sight of the road, relief came. Brief, but enough to fuel his final effort. He reached the car, opened the door quickly, and got in, locking everything in the same motion. The engine started on the first try. Daniel didn't look back immediately. He engaged the gear. It accelerated. Only then, already in motion, did he allow himself to look in the rearview mirror. What he saw made him slow down for a second. On the side of the road, partially hidden by the darkness, there were more figures, stops, observing but not moving forward. They were not pursuing them. They weren't trying to reach out. They were just there, as if there were a limit or a rule. Daniel accelerated again, driving away as fast as possible. The narrow road seemed longer than before, but he didn't slow down. Only when the city lights began to appear in the distance did his body begin to react to what had happened. But the mind wouldn't stop. None of it made complete sense. People weren't kidnapped to disappear. They were maintained, contained, because something about them was changing. And most importantly, it didn't begin at the castle. When he finally stopped the car, far enough away, Daniel turned off the engine and remained silent for a few seconds, heavy breathing. Hands still tense on the steering wheel. Then he realized something I hadn't noticed before. All the while, none of the men tried to stop him from leaving. No shots fired, no real persecution, no concrete attempt at containment outside the structure. And this led to only one conclusion. They weren't protecting the secret. They were protecting the world from what was inside. Daniel looked at his own hands, dirty, with small marks that I didn't remember making. Breathing slowed down, heavier. A doubt began to form, silent, but impossible to ignore. What if the problem wasn't just who was in the castle? What if the contact had already been enough? He gripped the steering wheel tighter. For the first time since the start of the investigation, the question was no longer about what was happening in that place, and it became about what would happen to him from then on. Daniel did not return home immediately. He drove aimlessly for almost an hour, keeping his distance from the city, as if the simple act of stopping would allow everything to catch up with him. The empty road, the silence inside the car, and the constant sound of the engine were the only things that still seemed normal. But his body wasn't there. His hands remained tense, even when he tried to relax them. His breathing, though more controlled, never fully returned to its natural rhythm. There was a persistent sensation, not exactly pain nor tiredness, but something internal, difficult to define. Something is out of place. He finally parked at a secluded gas station, turned off the car, and stood motionless for a few seconds. He looked at his reflection in the side window. Nothing visibly wrong, but that didn't mean much anymore. Daniel got out of the car and walked to the bathroom. The simple space, lit by cold light, contrasted violently with everything he had just experienced. He turned on the tap and washed his face, trying to reorganize his thoughts. Investigation, disappearances, containment, transformation. Everything was connected now, but the main answer was the most disturbing. That was no ordinary crime. It was a control system, and the castle was only a part of it. Daniel rested his hands on the sink, staring intently at himself in the mirror. That's when he realized. For a brief second, something in the eyes, a delay, almost imperceptible, as if the reflex wasn't perfectly synchronized. He blinked. The effect disappeared, but the feeling remained. Daniel slowly backed away. Now there was a new variable, himself. He returned to the car in silence, but this time he didn't start the engine immediately. He grabbed the recorder and the notepad. If there was any chance of things escalating, he needed to record everything while he still had his mind. He started talking. He recounted every detail. The structure, the men, the people held captive, their behavior, the escape. All objectively, as he always did in his investigations. But as he spoke, he noticed something changing. The words began to come out more slowly, not due to a lack of memory, but through interference. He stopped the recording. He took a deep breath. He tried again. It worked, but not in the same way. Something was affecting the process. Daniel turned off the recorder. Now there was no way to deny it anymore. The contact within the castle had not been neutral. He didn't know how, not even when exactly, but it had been enough. The logic he had always followed was beginning to fail. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. In the following days, he tried to act normally. He returned to a hotel in the nearest town, avoided direct contact with other people, and maintained isolation. He observed every detail of his own behavior: sleep, reflexes, concentration. Initially, the changes were subtle, minor lapses in attention, a feeling of irregular time, moments when the body seemed to act before conscious decision, nothing extreme, but progressive. Daniel tried to leave the city permanently on the third day. He packed his things, got into the car, and started driving toward the main highway, but something happened along the way. A hesitation, for no clear reason. He slowed down. He looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. But the feeling was there, as if there was something he wasn't noticing. But that was already a part of him. Daniel pulled the car over to the side of the road. He remained silent for a few seconds, and then he made a decision. He turned the steering wheel, and he returned. The road leading to the castle looked different now, no longer unknown, more family-oriented, too natural. When he arrived at the gate, it was already open, exactly as before. Daniel did not hesitate. He got out of the car, and he walked to the entrance. The main door was unlocked. He went in. The interior remained clean, silent, organized, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. This time, he didn't call for anyone. He didn't look for answers. He just walked, direct. As if he knew exactly where to go, he went up the stairs, he walked down the hallway, and he stopped in front of the same door, the biggest, no external door handle. This time, however, it was open. Daniel watched for a second, steady breathing, no tension, undoubtedly. Then he went in, and the door closed behind him. I am here. The case was never officially resolved. Days after his arrival in the region, Daniel Carter was reported missing. His car was found abandoned near a secondary road, with no signs of a struggle or evidence of a crime. His equipment, recorder, notes, documents, had disappeared. The investigation has not progressed, as in other cases. In the town of Ashford, the matter quickly returned to its usual silence. The castle remained where it had always been, isolated, intact, invisible to those who didn't know exactly where to look. Deliveries continued to be made, and occasionally new people were seen arriving. Always discreetly, without drawing attention. A few weeks later, a new name began to circulate among the few who still watched the place cautiously. A man, newcomer, reserved. He was rarely seen outside the property, but when it appeared, he seemed to be observing everything with far too much attention, as if he were learning. And now I ask you, if you were in Daniel's place, would you have entered that castle? Or would he have ignored the signs and left before it was too late? Stories like this leave us with a nagging question. How many places are out there, hidden in plain sight, where inexplicable things continue to happen without anyone noticing? And more importantly, is everything really trapped in there? Or has something already happened? And is it much closer than we imagine? If this story captivated you, until the end, feel free to leave a comment. What do you think really happens in that castle? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from. Your participation helps bring us more stories like this.